somewhere ahead of you, a version of yourself is waiting to find out whether you did it. Not a metaphor, not a mystical claim, a literal, specific person built entirely out of the decisions you are making today, who will either wake up grateful for what you gave them or wake up carrying the weight of what you didn't. That person cannot speak to you right now. They cannot warn you, cannot argue with you, cannot stop you from wasting this exact day the way so many days before it have already been wasted. All they can do is inherit whatever you leave them. Napoleon Hill spent his life studying men who understood something most people never fully grasp, that every present decision is, in fact, a message sent forward in time to someone who has no ability to talk back. The men who built enduring wealth, enduring reputations, enduring lives, were not the ones with the most talent. They were the ones who took that forward correspondence seriously, who made decisions today as though the person receiving them tomorrow actually mattered, rather than treating the future as an abstraction too distant to influence anything happening right now. Today, I want to make that correspondence real for you, not abstract gratitude toward a vague future. A specific, mechanical understanding of exactly how today's decisions become tomorrow's inheritance, and exactly what you can do, starting in the next few minutes, to make sure the person receiving that inheritance thanks you instead of resenting you. I want to be direct about what makes this subject different from ordinary motivational content, because it would be easy to mistake what follows for another version of vague encouragement to think about the future. What follows is considerably more specific than that, grounded in documented mechanisms of how the mind actually processes the concept of a future self, and organized into tools that can be applied today, not simply absorbed as an inspiring idea and then set aside once the video ends. The difference between an idea that changes a life and an idea that simply entertains for 40 minutes is almost always the presence or absence of a specific, actionable mechanism attached to it. This video is built entirely around providing that mechanism, the time discounting trap. There is a specific, well-documented flaw in how the human mind values time, and understanding it precisely is the foundation for everything else in this video, because without understanding this flaw, every good intention toward your future self will continue losing, quietly and predictably, to the pull of the present moment. The mind does not value a reward received next month the same way it values an identical reward received right now, even when the two are, by any rational measure, worth exactly the same. Offered a modest reward today versus a considerably larger reward next month, an enormous number of people will choose the smaller, immediate reward, not because the math favors it, but because immediacy itself carries a kind of psychological weight that distance simply doesn't, regardless of how much larger the distant reward actually is. This tendency has a name, time discounting, and it operates on nearly every financial, physical, and personal decision a person makes, almost always beneath conscious awareness. Here is why this matters so much more than it initially sounds like it should. Nearly every decision that benefits your future self carries a cost that lands entirely in the present, the effort, the discomfort, the sacrifice, all paid today, while the benefit lands entirely in the future, often considerably later than today. Time discounting means the mind, left to its own automatic tendencies, will systematically undervalue that future benefit relative to the present cost, producing a bias that consistently favors comfort now over gain later, even when the actual math overwhelmingly favors the opposite choice. This bias is not a character flaw unique to undisciplined people. It is a structural feature of how the human mind evaluates time, present in essentially everyone to some degree, and the people who build extraordinary outcomes across a lifetime are not people who don't experience this bias. They are people who have found specific, deliberate ways to counteract it, rather than assuming willpower alone will overcome a bias built into the basic architecture of decision-making. The remainder of this video is built entirely around giving you those specific counteracting tools, because understanding the bias without a tool to counteract it changes almost nothing about the decisions actually made once the video ends. There's a further wrinkle to this bias worth understanding before moving forward, because it explains why the trap is so difficult to notice while it's actively operating. The discounting effect is not constant across all distances into the future. It is disproportionately steep for the near future and comparatively shallow for the distant future. This means the difference in perceived value between a reward available right now and a reward available next week feels considerably larger than the difference in perceived value between a reward available in 10 years and one available in 11 years, even though, measured in absolute terms, both comparisons represent the identical single week of difference. This uneven discounting produces a specific practical trap. Decisions get evaluated with wildly different standards depending on how they happen to be framed in time. A choice framed as today versus next week triggers the full force of the steep near-term discounting, making the future option feel dramatically less appealing than it would if the identical choice were instead framed as occurring somewhere further out. This is precisely why so many people can commit, in the abstract, to a future change, starting tomorrow, starting next month, starting after some condition is met, with genuine sincerity, and then find that same commitment dissolving almost entirely once tomorrow actually arrives and becomes today. Subject suddenly to the much steeper discounting that only applies to genuinely immediate decisions. Recognizing this shift as it happens, rather than being surprised by it, is itself one of the more useful pieces of awareness available for counteracting the trap in the exact moment it's most likely to win. The two selves. Here is a finding that reframes the entire relationship between present decisions and future outcomes, and it comes from careful examination of how the brain processes the concept of a future version of yourself, compared to how it processes other people entirely. When people are asked to think about their present circumstances, specific regions of the brain associated with self-referential thinking become active, the same regions that activate when thinking about your own identity, your own preferences, your own immediate well-being. But when people are asked to think about their future self, particularly a future self many years removed from the present, a striking pattern emerges in a meaningful number of cases. The brain activity associated with self-referential thinking diminishes, and activity associated with thinking about a separate, unrelated person increases instead. In a very real, measurable sense, for many people, the future self is not processed by the brain as me. It is processed as someone else, a stranger, distant and abstract, whose well-being carries less automatic weight than the well-being of the person currently occupying this exact moment. This finding explains an enormous amount about why time discounting operates as powerfully as it does. It is far easier to shortchange a stranger than to shortchange yourself. And if the future self is neurologically processed as closer to a stranger than to the present self, decisions that trade away that stranger's well-being for the present self's comfort stop feeling like self-sabotage and start feeling, quietly and almost invisibly, like a reasonable trade between two separate parties, one of whom happens to be standing right here, making the decision, and one of whom is nowhere to be found and cannot object. Here is the specific, practical implication of this finding, and it forms the foundation for the tool described later in this video under vivid correspondence. The more vividly and specifically the future self can be imagined, not as an abstract concept, but as an actual, detailed, particular person, the more the brain's processing of that future self shifts back toward genuine self-referential thinking, closing the gap between me and stranger that the earlier research identified. This is not a minor psychological curiosity. It is one of the most actionable findings available for actually overcoming the time discounting trap, because it suggests the trap is weakened, measurably, simply by making the future self less abstract and more real in the mind of the person making today's decision. There's a related pattern worth naming because it helps explain why this abstraction problem gets worse rather than better the further into the future a person tries to look. A future self, only 1 week away, is relatively easy to picture with real specificity. The circumstances are close enough to the present that imagination barely needs to stretch to produce a vivid, plausible picture. A future self many years away requires the mind to imagine circumstances, surroundings, and even a physical appearance considerably removed from anything currently known, and this greater imaginative distance appears to correlate directly with the diminished self-referential processing described above. The further away the future self is, the more work the imagination has to do to keep that self vivid, and the more likely the mind is to default to the easier, more abstract, stranger-like representation instead. This has a direct practical consequence for how the exercises in this video should be approached. Rather than attempting to hold an extremely distant future self in mind, a version of yourself decades away, which the mind will struggle to render with any real vividness, it is often considerably more effective to work with a nearer future self, close enough to imagine in genuine specific detail, and to trust that a chain of well-served nearer future selves, each one handing off a genuine inheritance to the next, eventually reaches the distant future far more reliably than a single attempt to picture that distant point directly and act on its behalf today. Definite purpose as a debt owed forward. Hill's principle of definiteness of purpose is usually described in terms of clarity, knowing precisely what you want, rather than drifting through life with only a vague wish for improvement. I want to offer a reframing of this same principle that speaks directly to the subject of this video, because it changes the emotional weight the principle carries in a way that pure clarity alone does not. A definite purpose, understood correctly, is not simply a target you're reaching toward. It is a debt you are incurring on behalf of someone who cannot yet collect it, the future self who will either receive the benefit of that purpose being pursued or bear the cost of it being abandoned. Framing a goal this way transforms its psychological weight considerably. A goal framed purely as personal ambition can be abandoned on a difficult day without much internal resistance, because ambition, in the moment of difficulty, competes directly against comfort and frequently loses, consistent with the time discounting trap already described. A goal framed as a debt owed to a specific real person carries a different kind of weight, because abandoning a debt owed to someone else, even a future version of yourself, triggers a distinctly different internal response than simply lowering your own personal ambition. This reframing is not a rhetorical trick. It is a direct application of the finding described in the previous section, that vividly imagining the future self as a real, specific person shifts the brain's processing of that self closer to genuine self-concern rather than distant abstraction. A definite purpose framed as a debt owed forward asks you to hold that future person clearly in mind at the exact moment a decision is being made, rather than leaving that future person as a vague, unexamined abstraction, easily outweighed by whatever feels most pressing in the present. Here is the practical exercise. Take whatever definite purpose currently exists for you, or if none currently exists, choose one now with real specificity. Rewrite it, briefly, not as a personal ambition stated in the first person, but as an explicit debt. The version of me at Tay is depending on what I do today to reach WAMB. Read this rewritten version before any decision connected to that purpose, particularly decisions made under exactly the kind of resistance or fatigue that the time discounting trap depends on to win. There's an important boundary worth setting around this reframe, because taken too far, it risks producing the wrong kind of pressure, rather than the intended, useful kind. A debt owed to a genuinely cared-for future self should motivate through a felt sense of forward responsibility, not through anxiety or a punishing sense of obligation that makes every decision feel weighted down with dread. If the reframe described above begins producing the second kind of feeling rather than the first, something in the specific wording or the specific purpose being pursued likely needs adjustment, because a debt framing that produces dread tends, ironically, to trigger exactly the kind of present-moment escape-seeking that the time discounting trap thrives on, undermining the very effect the reframe was meant to produce. The distinguishing test is whether the future self being imagined in this exercise feels like someone you genuinely want to serve, out of a real, warm sense of connection to them, or whether they feel more like a demanding creditor you're anxious to avoid disappointing. The first framing is the one this video is built around, and it depends directly on the vividness principle described in the previous section. A future self imagined with genuine specificity and detail tends to be experienced with something closer to warmth and connection than a future self left vague and abstract, which is far more likely to default to feeling like an impersonal obligation rather than a real person worth caring for. The compound debt of small decisions. Nearly every conversation about future consequences focuses on large, dramatic decisions, a major choice, a significant turning point, a decision obviously large enough to warrant careful thought. This focus, while understandable, misses where the actual weight of a life is decided, because large decisions are, statistically, rare, while small decisions occur constantly, dozens of times a day, and it is the accumulated pattern of those small decisions, not the occasional large one, that determines the great majority of what a future self eventually inherits. Here is the mechanism, stated precisely. Any individual small decision, spending an hour on a distraction rather than a genuine priority, choosing comfort over a modest effort toward a stated purpose, deferring an uncomfortable but necessary action for one more day, carries almost no consequence in isolation. This is precisely why these decisions are so easy to justify in the moment. Measured against the standard of, will this single decision ruin anything? The honest answer is almost always no, but this standard is the wrong one to apply, because these decisions are never actually isolated. They repeat, in nearly identical form, across hundreds or thousands of occasions over months and years, and the cumulative effect of a repeated pattern is entirely different from the effect of any single instance of it. In exactly the same way, a single grain of sand means nothing, while an accumulated dune reshapes an entire landscape. This is the compound debt referenced in this section's title, and I want to be precise about why the word debt is the correct one rather than simply consequence. A debt accrues interest. It grows over time, independent of any single additional transaction, purely as a function of time passing, while the underlying balance remains unaddressed. The compounding pattern of small decisions works identically. A pattern of minor avoidance, sustained across years, does not simply produce years' worth of minor cost. It produces a considerably larger cost than the sum of the individual instances would suggest, because each instance of the pattern reinforces the identity underlying it, making the next instance of the same pattern slightly easier to justify, in exactly the self-reinforcing way that compound interest accelerates a financial debt beyond what the original borrowed amount alone would suggest. The corrective is not heroic effort applied occasionally to offset an otherwise unchanged pattern of small decisions. This rarely works, because the compound debt continues accruing on every day the underlying pattern remains unaddressed, regardless of how impressive any single occasional effort happens to be. The corrective is attention paid specifically to the small, repeated decisions themselves, the ones that feel too minor to matter in isolation, because it is precisely their minor, repeated, and therefore invisible nature that gives them their outsized compounding power over the years ahead. Here is a specific practical method for making this invisible pattern visible, because attention alone, without a concrete method for directing it, tends to fade within days once the initial resolve wears off. For 1 week, keep a simple, honest tally, nothing elaborate, a few words jotted at the end of each day, of every small decision that fell on either side of the pattern connected to your stated purpose, a moment chosen in favor of the future self's interest, and a moment chosen against it. Do not judge these entries as they're recorded, simply record them, because the judgment tends to produce either defensive minimizing or excessive self-criticism, neither of which serves the actual goal of this exercise, which is accurate observation rather than emotional reaction. At the end of the week, review the full tally at once, rather than reacting to any single day in isolation. What typically becomes visible once a full week of small decisions is laid out together rather than experienced one at a time is a pattern considerably clearer and often considerably more lopsided than any single day would have suggested on its own. This is the same mechanism responsible for why the compound debt itself remains invisible during ordinary daily life. Each individual decision is too small to register clearly, but the accumulated pattern, once actually gathered and reviewed together, becomes difficult to miss. This weekly review, repeated consistently, functions as an early warning system, catching a compounding pattern of small decisions considerably earlier than it would otherwise be noticed, typically only once its accumulated effects had already become large enough to be undeniable on their own. The regret audit. There is a specific and useful exercise available to anyone willing to look honestly at what people, near the actual end of their lives, report regretting, because this data offers something almost nothing else can, a genuine, hard-won preview of exactly what the future self at its most distant and most honest point actually cares about, stripped of all the present moment noise that so often obscures it during ordinary daily decision-making. The findings across extensive accounts from those who have spent time with people at the end of life converge on a remarkably consistent, narrow set of themes, and I want to walk through them directly, because each one carries a specific, actionable implication for the decisions being made today. The most frequently reported regret involves not having lived a life true to one's own values, having instead lived according to what others expected. The implication here is direct. Decisions made primarily to satisfy external expectation rather than genuine internal conviction, are precisely the decisions most likely to generate regret when viewed from the distant future, regardless of how reasonable or even admirable they appeared to satisfy in the present moment. A second frequently reported regret involves having worked too much at the expense of relationships and experiences that, from the vantage point of the end, mattered considerably more than whatever the excess work produced. The implication is not that work itself is regrettable. Purposeful, definite work is central to everything Hill wrote about, but that work pursued past the point of genuine purpose, simply as habit or as avoidance of something harder, is where this specific regret tends to concentrate. A third frequently reported regret involves not having expressed genuine feelings, having instead suppressed them to maintain a peace that, in retrospect, cost more than the discomfort of honest expression would have. A fourth involves losing touch with friendships that, in the busyness of ordinary life, seemed replaceable or postponable, and that turned out, from the distant vantage point, to have been considerably harder to rebuild or replace than assumed at the time. A fifth, and this one deserves particular attention because it connects directly to the theme of this entire video, involves not having allowed oneself to be happier, not due to external circumstance, but due to a specific pattern of fear, and specifically a fear of change that kept a person tethered to a familiar unhappiness rather than pursuing an uncertain but genuinely better alternative. The exercise here is direct. Review your own current pattern of decisions against these 5 themes, honestly, and identify which one currently carries the greatest risk of becoming your own version of this same regret. That identification is not meant to produce guilt. It is meant to produce the same specific, targeted attention described in the previous section, attention directed at exactly the pattern most likely to compound into genuine loss by the time your own future self is in a position to look back honestly. It's worth pausing on why this particular body of evidence carries the specific weight it does, distinct from ordinary advice about how to live well. Nearly every other source of guidance about how to prioritize a life comes from people still actively living it, still subject to the exact time discounting bias described at the start of this video, still capable of having their stated priorities overridden by whatever present moment pull happens to be strongest on any given day. The accounts gathered from those at the actual end of life are different in kind, not simply in degree, because the speaker has by definition exhausted the very currency, remaining time, that the time discounting trap depends on treating as abundant and therefore discountable. There is no future left to trade against, and without that future to trade against, the reported priorities tend to strip away nearly everything that was, in earlier decades, distorted by the same bias this entire video has been describing. This is precisely why the 5 themes converge, as consistently as they do, across an enormous range of otherwise very different lives, very different cultures, very different circumstances. They represent something close to an unbiased report, the answer to what actually mattered, given by someone no longer capable of discounting the future because no future remains to discount. Treating this convergent evidence with the seriousness it deserves, rather than filing it away as a mildly sobering but ultimately abstract observation, is precisely the kind of vivid engagement with the future self that the earlier sections of this video have identified as the actual mechanism for overcoming the bias in the first place. The sacrifice reframed. A specific word does enormous quiet damage throughout this entire subject, and it deserves direct examination. Sacrifice. The word implies a pure loss, something given up, gone, unrecovered, and framing present effort on behalf of a future self in these terms makes every single decision feel like a subtraction, which is precisely the framing that gives the time discounting trap its greatest leverage, since a pure loss in the present, weighed against an abstract future benefit, will very often lose that comparison exactly as described earlier in this video. Here is a more accurate reframe, and it changes the felt experience of these decisions considerably. What gets labeled as sacrifice in this context is, more precisely, a transaction, an exchange of present comfort for future benefit, conducted with a specific counterparty who happens to be you at a later point in time. Every transaction involves giving something up in exchange for receiving something else, and no reasonable person describes an ordinary favorable transaction as a pure sacrifice, because the exchange, understood correctly, produces a net gain rather than a net loss, even though something real was genuinely given up as part of it. This reframe matters because pure sacrifice, held in mind as the operating description of a decision, produces a specific and corrosive emotional residue over time, a quiet sense of ongoing loss, deprivation, resentment even, toward whatever purpose is being served by the sacrifice. A transaction, by contrast, held in mind as the operating description of the identical decision, produces a fundamentally different emotional residue, closer to the felt experience of a deliberate, chosen investment, made because the exchange rate genuinely favors the person making it once the full timeline is honestly accounted for. The practical adjustment is linguistic, but produces a genuinely different internal experience. Before any decision that trades present comfort for future benefit, replace the internal framing of "I am giving this up" with "I am trading this for something worth considerably more, received by someone who happens to be me, later." This is not a denial that something real is being given up in the present moment. It plainly is. It is an accurate correction to the incomplete framing that describes only the giving up half of a transaction while ignoring the receiving half entirely, a framing error that, left uncorrected, makes disciplined decisions feel unnecessarily punishing across years that didn't need to feel that way at all. There's a further refinement worth adding to this reframe, because a transaction, properly understood, requires the exchange rate to actually be favorable, and simply labeling something a transaction rather than a sacrifice does not, on its own, guarantee that the exchange being made is genuinely a good one. This distinction matters because there is a real difference between disciplined effort in service of a genuinely worthwhile purpose and mere self-denial, pursued without a clear, specific target behind it. The second of these does not become a good transaction simply by being relabeled and pursuing it under the transactional framing described above without an actual valuable purpose attached, risks producing a different, equally corrosive problem, joyless austerity mistaken for virtue, disconnected from any real future benefit that would actually justify it. The test for distinguishing a genuinely favorable transaction from mere unexamined self-denial is whether the specific future benefit can be named with real clarity, connected directly to the definite purpose established earlier in this video. "I am giving this up because discipline is generally good" is not a favorable transaction. It's an abstraction with no verifiable exchange rate attached to it. "I am giving up this specific hour of comfort because it directly advances the specific outcome my future self at this specific point is depending on" is a genuinely valuable transaction, and evaluating it honestly, rather than assuming discipline is inherently virtuous regardless of what it's actually purchasing, is what keeps this entire reframe grounded in something real rather than becoming its own quiet, unproductive form of suffering. The permission trap. There is a specific phrase, or some close variant of it, that precedes an enormous number of decisions that quietly work against the future self described throughout this video. And I want to name it directly because recognizing it in the moment is one of the most immediately useful tools this video offers. I deserve this. To be entirely clear before going further, there is nothing inherently wrong with genuine reward, genuine enjoyment, or genuine rest. A life organized entirely around future benefit with no present enjoyment at all is neither what Hill advocated nor a genuinely sustainable way to live, and a later section of this video addresses this balance directly. The permission trap being described here is narrower and more specific, the use of "I deserve this," not as an honest assessment of a genuinely earned and proportionate reward, but as a reflexive justification deployed specifically to override a decision that, examined honestly, works against the stated purpose and the future self depending on it. Here is the tell that distinguishes genuine, proportionate reward from the permission trap operating under its disguise. Genuine reward tends to arrive after a specific, identifiable effort, proportionate in scale to that effort, and tends to be enjoyed without triggering any subsequent internal argument about whether it was actually justified. The permission trap, by contrast, tends to arrive reflexively, disconnected from any specific preceding effort, disproportionate to whatever effort can be identified, and tends to be followed, often within the same day, by a quiet, nagging internal argument about whether it was actually a good decision, an argument that wouldn't exist at all if the reward had been genuinely proportionate and genuinely earned. The practical tool here is a single pause, applied specifically at the moment the phrase "I deserve this" or its equivalent arises, before a decision that trades away something connected to the stated purpose from earlier in this video. Ask honestly whether a specific, proportionate effort actually precedes this specific reward, or whether the phrase is being deployed simply because the present moment wants relief from an ongoing discomfort connected to that purpose. The first case is genuine reward and should be enjoyed without hesitation. The second case is the permission trap, quietly borrowing against the future self's account to pay for a present moment relief that, examined honestly, was never actually earned by anything that happened first. There's a broader cultural current worth naming here, because it explains why this particular trap has become so much easier to fall into than it likely was in earlier eras. A great deal of modern messaging across advertising, social platforms, and casual cultural conversation actively encourages the deployment of "you deserve this" as a justification detached from any actual preceding effort, precisely because that detachment makes the phrase applicable to far more purchasing and consumption decisions than a genuinely effort-linked version of deserving would allow. This is not a coincidence or an accident of language. A version of deserving, untethered from actual effort, is considerably more commercially useful than a version that requires real, specific justification, and the sheer frequency with which the untethered version gets repeated back to a person across an ordinary day makes it considerably harder to notice as a distinct pattern worth questioning, rather than simply an unremarkable, constantly reinforced background assumption about how reward is supposed to work. Recognizing this broader current does not require rejecting reward or enjoyment altogether. That overcorrection would be its own mistake, addressed directly in the earlier discussion of the sacrifice reframe. It requires simply restoring the actual link between reward and the effort that should precede it, a link that a great deal of surrounding cultural noise actively works to dissolve, specifically because a dissolved link is more profitable for whoever benefits from that particular reward being purchased in that particular moment. Building future self-trust. Here is a dimension of this entire subject that operates beneath nearly every other tool described so far, and understanding it explains why some people find these tools considerably easier to apply than others do, even when starting from an identical set of circumstances. Every kept promise to yourself, however small, deposits a specific form of evidence into an internal account, evidence that you are, in fact, the kind of person who follows through on stated commitments, even when circumstances make following through inconvenient. Every broken promise to yourself, conversely, deposits the opposite evidence, and this accumulated evidence, whichever direction it points, becomes the actual foundation underlying how much internal trust exists between the present self making a decision and the future self depending on it. This matters enormously for the entire subject of this video, because every tool described so far, the reframe definite purpose, the attention to compounding small decisions, the transactional reframe of sacrifice, the resistance to the permission trap, depends, at some level, on a present self willing to genuinely act on behalf of a future self it cannot currently see or verify. That willingness is not uniform across everyone, and it is not fixed. It is built, specifically and mechanically, through the accumulated history of kept versus broken promises to yourself, in exactly the same way any other form of trust between two parties is built through a track record rather than through declaration alone. The practical implication is direct, and it explains why the small decisions addressed earlier in this video matter as much as they do, beyond even their direct compounding effect. Every small commitment kept, the modest promise made and honored, even when it would have been easy and consequence-free to skip it, is not simply producing whatever direct benefit that specific commitment was meant to produce. It is also, simultaneously, making every future commitment easier to keep because it is adding to an accumulating record of evidence that closes the trust gap between present self and future self, the exact gap identified earlier in this video's discussion of how the brain processes the future self as closer to a stranger than to the current self. Begin, if this trust gap currently feels wide, with commitments small enough that keeping them is nearly guaranteed, the same principle underlying the minimum viable approach used in building any sustained new behavior. A small, consistently kept promise builds trust considerably faster than a large, ambitious promise broken partway through, because trust is built through the reliability of the pattern, not through the size of any individual commitment within it. It's worth naming directly what happens when this trust-building process is skipped, because it explains a specific, frustrating pattern many people experience without fully understanding its source. Repeatedly setting large, ambitious goals with genuine initial sincerity and repeatedly abandoning them partway through, despite each new attempt beginning with what feels like renewed and genuine resolve. This pattern is rarely a simple failure of willpower in any single instance. It is, more precisely, the accumulated effect of an internal trust deficit built up across previous broken commitments, a deficit that makes each new large commitment progressively harder to sustain because some part of the mind, drawing on the accumulated evidence of previous attempts, has already concluded, correctly based on that evidence, that commitments of this size tend not to be honored. Breaking this specific pattern requires deliberately stepping back from large, ambitious commitments temporarily in favor of a sustained run of small, easily honored ones, specifically to rebuild the underlying trust before attempting anything larger again. This can feel, at first, like an unsatisfying detour, particularly for anyone accustomed to measuring progress by the size of the goal being pursued rather than by the reliability of the pattern underlying it. But the detour is considerably shorter than the alternative, another cycle of ambitious commitment followed by abandonment, adding yet another entry to the accumulated evidence of broken trust, making the next attempt after that one even harder than this one was. Rebuilding trust through small, reliable commitments is not a lesser strategy adopted for lack of ambition. It is the actual foundation that eventually makes larger, more ambitious commitments genuinely sustainable once enough evidence has accumulated in the right direction to close the gap this section has been describing. Vivid correspondence. Building directly on the finding described earlier, that vividly imagining the future self shifts the brain's processing of that self closer to genuine self-concern rather than distant abstraction, here is a specific practical exercise designed to exploit that finding deliberately on a regular basis, rather than leaving it to occur only incidentally. Once each week, set aside a genuinely uninterrupted 10 minutes and write a short letter addressed directly to yourself at a specific future point. 1 year forward is a useful starting distance, specific enough to imagine concretely while distant enough to matter meaningfully for the themes addressed throughout this video. Write this letter as though addressing a real, specific person, because that is precisely what you are doing, however unfamiliar that framing initially feels. Describe, briefly, the specific decision or pattern currently under consideration, whatever purpose, however defined, is currently being pursued or neglected. Describe it not in vague terms, but with real specificity, naming the actual small decisions currently accumulating for better or worse. Then, and this is the essential part of the exercise, write a brief response, as though from that future self, addressed back to the present self writing the letter. This response should describe, in specific and plausible detail, either genuine gratitude for a pattern that was maintained or genuine cost from a pattern that was allowed to compound unaddressed, written honestly, based on the actual current trajectory, not on wishful thinking in either direction. This exercise functions, mechanically, as a deliberate, repeated application of the exact mechanism identified in the neurological research addressed earlier, making the future self vivid, specific, and personal, rather than abstract and distant, which directly counteracts the specific bias responsible for so much of the time discounting trap this entire video has been built around addressing. Performed weekly, across a sustained period, this exercise accomplishes for the relationship between present and future self something similar to what regular, direct communication accomplishes for any other relationship that would otherwise drift toward neglect through simple distance and infrequent contact. There's a specific reason the written form of this exercise matters more than simply thinking through the same content mentally, and it's worth understanding before dismissing the writing itself as an unnecessary formality. The act of writing forces a level of specificity that unstructured thinking rarely achieves on its own, because vague mental impressions can remain comfortably vague indefinitely, while a written sentence has to commit to actual, particular words, actual specific details, in a way loose thinking never quite has to. This forced specificity is precisely the mechanism doing the work described in the earlier neurological research. A vaguely imagined future self provides little of the vividness needed to shift the brain's processing of that self toward genuine self-concern, while a specifically written one forced into concrete language through the physical act of writing, provides considerably more. A second, related benefit of the written form connects directly to the trust building described in the previous section. A written letter, dated and kept, becomes its own accumulating record over time. Read back after several months. A collection of these letters reveals with the same honest clarity as the net worth tracking or the visible habit chain described in other contexts, whether the pattern being described in each successive letter has actually moved in the intended direction, or whether the same unaddressed concern keeps reappearing, letter after letter, without any real progress against it. This accumulated written record becomes, over a sustained period, one of the most honest available instruments for tracking whether the tools described throughout this video are genuinely being applied, or whether they've quietly remained an appealing idea without translating into an actual, sustained change in daily behavior. The legacy habit. I want to draw a distinction between two categories of action, because understanding this distinction changes how effort gets allocated across an ordinary day, and this distinction connects directly to which decisions actually deserve the heightened attention this entire video has been describing. Some actions are fully consumed by the moment in which they occur. Their value exists only in that moment, and once the moment passes, nothing durable remains behind. This is not a criticism of such actions. A great many genuinely valuable experiences fall into precisely this category, and a life without them would be considerably poorer for the absence. But these actions, whatever their immediate value, do not compound forward the way this entire video has been describing, and treating them as though they carry the same forward weight as the second category leads to a specific and common error, either neglecting genuinely valuable present moment experience in service of an overcorrected future focus, or, more commonly given the time discounting trap already described, mistaking a moment-consumed action for a legacy action simply because it felt significant while it was happening. The second category, the legacy habit properly understood, consists of actions whose value persists and compounds beyond the moment of their occurrence. The specialized skill practiced today that remains available tomorrow, the relationship deliberately nurtured today whose trust continues accumulating afterward, the piece of specific, definite work advanced today that remains advanced rather than reverting once the moment passes. These actions carry a specific quality the first category lacks. Their benefit is not consumed by being experienced, it is banked, available to the future self as a genuine inheritance rather than as a memory of a moment that has already fully concluded. The practical exercise here is a simple daily audit, applied at the end of each day for a genuine but honest self-assessment of everything done today, which actions were fully consumed by the day itself, and which actions were deposited forward, available to be built upon tomorrow. Neither category needs to dominate entirely. A life composed only of legacy habits, with no moment-consumed enjoyment at all, is precisely the kind of unbalanced life this video is not advocating for. But an honest daily accounting of the ratio between the two categories reveals, over time, whether the actual pattern of a life matches the intention described throughout the rest of this video, or whether the intention exists only as a stated aspiration, while the actual daily pattern quietly favors the fully consumed category almost exclusively. There's a subtlety worth adding to this distinction because the two categories are not always as cleanly separable as the initial framing suggests, and treating them as entirely separate risks, missing some of the most valuable actions available. Certain actions occupy both categories simultaneously. A genuinely present, attentive conversation with someone important is fully experienced and enjoyed in the moment it occurs, exactly like a purely moment-consumed action, while also depositing forward into the accumulated trust and depth of that relationship, exactly like a purely legacy action. These dual-category actions deserve particular attention and priority precisely because they don't require the trade-off the simpler framing implies between present enjoyment and future deposit. They provide both simultaneously, and identifying which of your own regular activities fall into this dual category, rather than purely one or the other, often reveals some of the highest value uses of time available across an ordinary day. The daily audit, then, benefits from a third category alongside the original two, actions that were both fully enjoyed in the moment and genuinely deposited forward. Actively seeking to increase the frequency of this third category, where realistically possible, offers a way to serve both the present self and the future self simultaneously, rather than treating their interests as perpetually in tension, which the earlier sections of this video may have implied more strongly than is actually the case for every single decision. Tension between present and future genuinely exists in many decisions, and this video has focused primarily on how to navigate that tension well. But it does not exist in all of them, and recognizing the decisions where it doesn't exist at all is its own valuable skill, worth developing alongside everything else described here. The bridge decision. Everything described across this video converges into a single practical question, and I want to make sure it doesn't remain abstract by the time this video ends. Somewhere in your current life, there is exactly one decision available to you today that your future self, at whatever distant point they eventually arrive, will trace the great majority of their gratitude or their regret directly back to. Not because every other decision doesn't matter. The compounding pattern of small decisions addressed earlier in this video applies to all of them. But because there is typically one decision, larger or more foundational than the ordinary daily pattern, currently sitting available and unaddressed, that functions as a genuine bridge between the person you are today and the person your future self will become. This bridge decision is usually identifiable by a specific combination of features. It has been avoided, in some form, for a meaningful length of time already. It carries genuine present moment discomfort or risk, which is precisely why it has been avoided. And it connects directly and obviously to the definite purpose addressed earlier in this video, in a way that makes its avoidance one of the clearest examples of the time discounting trap actively operating in your own life right now, today, rather than as an abstract concept discussed in the earlier portions of this video. Identify this decision now, specifically in writing if possible. It is very likely something you already know, sitting somewhere just beneath conscious attention, precisely because genuine avoidance tends to work by not looking directly at the thing being avoided, rather than through active, conscious denial. Once identified, apply every tool described across this video directly to it. Reframe it as a debt owed to a specific future self, rather than a personal ambition easily abandoned. Recognize the specific small decisions currently compounding around its ongoing avoidance. Reframe whatever discomfort it requires as a transaction rather than a pure sacrifice. Watch specifically for the permission trap arriving to justify continued avoidance. And write, this week, the vivid letter described earlier, addressed specifically to the future self, shaped most directly by whether this particular bridge decision is finally crossed or continues being postponed. I want to name directly why this particular decision so often remains unaddressed, despite being, in most cases, already identified somewhere beneath conscious attention exactly as described above. The bridge decision tends to be avoided not because its importance is unclear, but because it typically requires confronting the steepest possible version of the time discounting bias described at the very start of this video, the largest available gap between immediate discomfort and distant reward, which is precisely what makes it a bridge decision in the first place, rather than an ordinary small decision easily addressed in passing. A decision with only a modest gap between present cost and future benefit rarely requires sustained avoidance to begin with. It simply gets done, without much internal resistance, because the trade is close enough in time and scale that the discounting bias barely has room to operate. This is precisely why the bridge decision deserves the concentrated, deliberate application of every tool this video has described, rather than being approached the same way an ordinary small decision would be. It represents the single clearest test available in your own actual life right now of whether the tools described throughout this video function as genuine correctives to the bias they were built to address, or whether they remain, for now, only theoretically understood rather than practically applied. Crossing it. Using these tools deliberately rather than waiting for a feeling of readiness that the time discounting trap will likely never voluntarily supply is the single most direct action available to you today in service of everything this video has been building toward. The charge. Somewhere ahead of you, a specific version of yourself is waiting to find out what you did with today. Not with your whole life, with today, specifically, this exact 24 hours, because it is today's decisions, compounding alongside every other day's decisions before and after it, that actually determine what that future person eventually inherits. Hill did not find that the men he studied lived free of the exact bias described at the start of this video. The pull toward present comfort over future benefit exists in every human mind, without exception. What he found was a specific, deliberate practice of holding the future clearly in view, vividly, specifically, as though it were a real person rather than an abstract eventual outcome, because that vividness, exactly as the research described earlier confirms, is what actually closes the gap between present self and future self, converting a distant stranger's well-being into something that genuinely matters in the decisions being made right now. You now have the specific tools this requires. Identify the bridge decision. Write the letter this week. Watch for the permission trap the next time it arrives, disguised as something you've earned. And treat every small, repeated decision today with the seriousness that its compounding nature actually deserves, rather than the seriousness its momentary size would suggest. Your future self is not waiting passively. They are actively depending on what happens in the next 24 hours. Give them something to thank you for. There is no version of this video that can act on your behalf. Every tool described across the last 40 minutes, the reframed debt, the compounding small decisions, the regret audit, the transactional reframe, the resistance to the permission trap, the trust built through kept promises, the vivid weekly letter, the honest accounting of legacy versus consumed actions, and the single bridge decision waiting to be crossed, depends entirely on being applied, starting today, by the only person capable of applying them, the version of you sitting here right now, holding, for these next few minutes, complete authority over what the future actually receives. Go and do it.